Is everybody ready for the first talk of this conference? Yay! Fantastic. So I'm not sure if the first speaker really needs an introduction. I mean, I think about 100 or 150 years ago, I invited him to do a workshop in the Netherlands, and that was sold out within a few minutes. So even back then, he was really, really well known. I saw him a few years ago at the very first Smashing conference, where he did this incredible talk with just 3 slides. And he told me just now that the year afterward, he did a talk with just 1 slide. Today, he told me he has 170 slides, so this will be a bit of an experiment to see how that works out. Now, this conference, there is this running theme through some of the talks, which is that these talks are about using things like pattern libraries or design systems or frameworks and things like style guides. And this talk by Andy is actually about not using any of those. Please give a very warm welcome to Andy Clarke.
Cheers, Dave. Thanks, mate. What a way to make a man feel old. Honestly. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Front End for inviting me to this, especially to start the show, which is brilliant. I think we're in for a couple of really fantastic days. So I'm looking forward to getting this over with and sitting down there with you and listening to everybody else. You look like a nice room full of people down here. You look so much more intelligent and better looking than those losers upstairs. So my talk today, the slides are online. This is a brand new talk, so I would actually really like your feedback. Here's how you can reach me, and my DMs are open to everybody, so send me a message if you like to. Now, a little bit of background. I studied fine art 150 years ago, so I'm not a graphic designer. I'm pretty much self-taught, so I've always been slightly uncomfortable describing myself as a designer. But I call myself a web designer because that's what I've done for the last, 20 years. And I run a small studio where we make creative work for clients and for the web. And for the past couple of years, I've been talking at conferences about, I'm frankly disappointed in what I see as the current state of design on the web. And I've been talking about why I believe that design has been lacking in originality and personality, and somehow it's even been stripped of its soul. Now, not everybody thinks the same way. Ethan Marcotte, bless him, he commented that there's an opportunity and a need to set up better models for criticism in our industry. Talk of the web's soul isn't it, said Ethan. And Scott Jale, he added that for him, the soul of a great site is fast, broad access, and utility. You know what? That sort of comment makes me really sad. But I'm not surprised, because accessibility and performance and usability, they all matter, I understand that, but they're not enough, not on their own. You know, the web is not a utility. It's not a terminal that gives us answers to questions that we ask it. It's not just a platform for the digital products that we've all become so infatuated with building. The web can, and it should be, a vibrant medium for creative expression in the same way as film and print and other media. You know, what we do as web professionals should be about so much more than just the execution. The web should be a creative melting pot and a proving ground for new ideas. So whether we are broadcasting news or selling product, creative thought, it's as important as accessibility and performance and usability. You know, I did feel like a bit of a lone voice for a long time because I was pining for conversations about creativity, and I was longing to see creative ideas expressed visually on the web. I honestly tried really hard not to sound like some bad-tempered old man, just complaining that website design wasn't as good as how I remember it from my day. Because trust me, it wasn't. Because back then we had guest books and hit counters and lots of little men in hard hats constructing in GIFs. So I do feel lucky, though, to have started working on the web at a time when we still somehow challenged the idea of what a website could be. So over the past year, I've found that in articles and conference talks, there are people out there that share these concerns. So outside the industry, I've heard from clients who they want to present themselves and what they do or they sell differently. Not for difference's sake, but because they've become to appreciate that for a successful business or product, creative design is as important as responsiveness or research. Now, you'll find video of the last year's talk on my website, and in it I did speak about the reasons why I think design has been lacking in originality and personality and in soul. Because there's this fixation we have with designing digital products, and somehow that's meant that we've forgotten that the web is a medium for creative expression outside of apps. And we've become so infatuated with processes like atomic design and tools like pattern libraries or style guides that we're ultimately losing sight of what we're making. And we have this unwillingness to take risks, maybe for fear of criticism or failure. So our reliance on research and testing means that we're just delegating decision-making, and we're abdicating responsibility for our designs. And our failure to understand art direction and why that matters as much on the web as it does in print. And that's what I'm here today to talk about. I want to talk about what art directors do and how art direction itself can improve what we make for the web. So what I'm going to cover applies as much to promoting digital products as it does to telling stories. And I'm going to share some practical advice on how you can make designs that are more creatively satisfying without compromising the accessibility or performance or utility that we should so rightly be concerned with. So, what do you think of when you hear the term art direction? Do you think about maybe responsive images? Think about presenting alternative crops or sizes or orientations to different screen sizes? Maybe use the picture element or use sizes in HTML. These have become useful responsive design and art direction tools, but there's more to web design than just the tools. Maybe you think about those designers like Jason Santamaria or Trent Walton, who art direct their writing by giving each entry its own distinctive image or layout or typography. And this gets us closer to understanding art direction, but images and layout and typography, they're only the result of art direction. They're not the meaning of it. So if art direction isn't exactly those things, what precisely is it? Well, in a sentence, it's the art of distilling an essential or precise meaning or purpose from a piece of content. Whether that be a magazine article or maybe a list of reasons why to use the coolest app from the latest hot startup. and then conveying that meaning or purpose better through design. Now, we don't hear much about art direction on the web for reasons that I'll talk about later. But it is well established in other medium, perhaps maybe the most memorable being magazines or maybe to a certain extent newspapers. Now, I'm not old enough to remember Alexei Brodovich's work from Harper's Bazaar magazine. I might be 150 years old, but I wasn't around in 1934. I'm not fashionable enough to have read Man About Town magazine, believe it or not, or seen Tom Wolsey's work, but I do remember from the 80s Neville Brody's artistic art direction for The Face magazine. Anybody remember this? And I'm still inspired by that every day. And then there's the Guardian newspaper redesign, in particular Mark Porter's redesign in 2010. And magazines and newspapers, they found the web challenging for a lot of business and technical reasons. But they're also really struggling to bring the same levels of art direction to their websites as they do for print editions. Now, one possible exception to that is ProPublica. And that's an independent, non-profit newsroom. It's based in Manhattan. And I think I can better explain how art directors work with writers and others to attract attention and convey ideas, and most importantly, stimulate emotions by talking about this story. This was art directed for the web by ProPublica's design director, David Slate, and it won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. Now, this tells a story of a woman who reported her assault to her local police department and was then charged with a misdemeanor for false reporting. And this story is even more notable because it was written by two journalists. So that in itself isn't unusual, but instead of merging the two voices into one, the editor kept them separate. And that's because one was reporting from the point of view of the woman and the other from the police. And in his role as art director, David recognized that the way the story was told across two timelines and by these two alternating voices made it much more powerful. So he emphasized that in the design. So the woman's story uses specially commissioned illustrations, whereas the police story includes photography. And her story is on the left half of the page, while theirs is on the right. And then the introduction and the epilogue are in the center. And this is a powerful story, but it's told more emotively because of its art direction. So let's compare that to this. This is another piece from ProPublica. This time it was produced for the web by Emily Martinez and Rob Waker, and it's about Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera, who's better known as the Mexican drug lord El Chapo. So this is a story about violence. And the specially commissioned illustrations by Tim McDonough, they really communicate that violence with an intensity that would be difficult to achieve using photography. And then finally, there's this example, there's Busted, which is an expose of false positives in police roadside drug testing kits. And the effects on people's lives from being falsely accused of taking drugs after only taking cold remedies is told better through the art direction. The testing kit in the header image is really small, which adds scale to the devastating consequences of these accusations. So the presentation of these stories and more, they share ProPublica's design DNA. There's some visual consistency because they're all set using the same typeface and on the same grid. But they feel entirely different because art direction enhances the story. So I bet a good many of you are sitting there thinking right now, what does this have to do with me? What does it have to do with the work that I do? Maybe you see art direction as some activity that's more suited maybe to the print world than it is to the web. Maybe you think it's elitist in some way, but I don't think that's true. Because stories are stories, no matter where they're told or through what medium. And they may be thought-provoking ones like those published on ProPublica, or they might be the story of your company and why your customers should do business with you. Then there's a story maybe of your charity and why it supports good causes and why people should donate to it. Or there's the story of your startup's new app and why somebody should download it. And with all of these stories, there's a deeper message that goes beyond just telling the facts about what you do and what you sell. So you need to go beyond the day-to-day of what your company does and think about what that means for people. Your product probably does everything that you say that it does. But what effect does it have on people's lives? So art direction is about understanding those messages and then deciding how best to communicate them through the organization and presentation of words and visuals. So is it relevant for the web? Well, yes, of course. Art directors use design to help people better understand the significance of content, and that's as important on the web as it is in print. In fact, the basic principles of art direction haven't changed between print and digital. And I go further by saying that art direction is essential to creating cohesive experiences across multiple channels so that the meaning of your content isn't lost in the gaps between devices and screen sizes. So, my friend, former design director at The Guardian, Mark Porter, who I've had the pleasure of learning from, he said, when you do a newspaper redesign, you're also designing a website, pages for mobile, and for apps. Conceptually, it all has to fit together, and it's about having a visual identity for a brand that works in print and also in other channels. Because, as well as helping someone establish a relationship with the content that they're reading, art direction can connect them with the spirit of the publication. And one of the most important tools for demonstrating that spirit is typography. And Mark also said, good editorial design is firstly about making people want to read, and then about telling stories. And that truth applies as much for design on the web, if not more, than it does in editorial, because typography is absolutely key to a website's visual identity. Because type can convey seriousness or playfulness or youthfulness. But designs based on type, they can be really hard, not because typography itself is hard, but because typographic designs often need closer collaboration between editorial and design. And that doesn't happen very often in many organizations. So I could, and I won't, spend an entire day just talking about typography. But I am going to explain just a few small ways that you can use type to emphasize the meaning of content in art direction. Let's start with some quotes. So block quotes and pull quotes are a clear example of when a designer and an editorial collaboration can improve someone's understanding of a story. You know, we can move beyond just putting ordinary quote marks and other symbols in our quotes and use something that reflects the content or the personality of the publication. You know, quotes lead people into a story, so we can represent that through design by using the grid to outdent the quote and then using a symbol to literally point the way back in. And we often draw attention to block quotes and pull quotes by contrasting them with the typography of the body copy, but using the same size and the same weight. What we're essentially saying is these things are equally as important. In contrast, if you use a different type treatment and you place the quotation at the center of someone's reading experience, and with Flexbox and CSS Grid, we've now got layout tools that enable us to place the content visually, but still maintain an appropriate source order. Or we can allow quotations to subtly interrupt the reading experience by just indenting them slightly into the right edge. Be careful if you're going to do it on the left, because it makes it more difficult for the eye to find the start of the next line. So my inspiration, art director Neville Brody, he often used varying type sizes to emphasize certain words. And this can be really effective inside a block or a pull quote. And they can really help make striking typographic designs by creating focal points and then leading someone's eye towards a call to action. But it takes collaboration between design and editorial to determine the number and the length and the placement of these quotes. I don't know whether you saw Jeremy Keith's article complaining about block quotes a couple of weeks ago. Let's move on to something else. Let's move on to headings. So headings demonstrate hierarchy and they signal the importance of content, but they can do much more than just demand attention. Headlines help to set the scene, so we can choose typefaces that reflect the subject matter. So this is a story about Jules Verne, who's the author of Journey to the Center of the Earth. And we can enhance that by using this modern serif typeface. It might have looked at home in 1864 when this book was written. But we needn't always position the headlines at the start of the story. If we put a headline after the first few paragraphs, it turns them into a prologue. This typeface is based on a grid, so it really echoes the grid created by our use of CSS columns. And we can experiment using transforms to position a headline slightly outside the viewport. And if we tighten the leading and the tracking and create overlapping shapes, we can turn type into a distinctive visual element. But they needn't be large to attract attention. If we combine small type with large amounts of white space, and that amount of white space feels really luxurious, but we can keep making it responsive by adjusting the proportion across media queries. And we don't always need images to add visual interest to a design. Deconstructed text can be much more interesting. So we can use SVG and the picture element to make sure that everybody's seeing a design that's appropriate to their device. Now, in magazine parlance, an introduction or a lead paragraph is sometimes referred to as a stand first. And we can use stand firsts to do more than just introduce an article. So here, that generous amount of white space between the stand first and the start of the article gives a reader time to pause and then take a breath before they begin to read. Or we can give a stand first visual prominence by making it the only center-aligned text on the page and then add an amount of leading that reflects its importance. And they can come first so that we can position them above the headline and maybe use borders between those overlong lines of text which draw a visual connection to the columns of text that come below. Or we can create more of a contemporary magazine feel by using generous leading and aligning that stand first with the columns of the text below. And we can emphasize its difference by aligning the text to the right. Or we might separate it visually from the body copy by setting it in uppercase, and improving the legibility by loosening the leading. So every element presents an opportunity to tell a story through typography. And readers will reward the time that you spend designing type with their attention. Every element, no matter how small, also presents us with an opportunity to be creative. Let's look at drop caps, simple drop caps. These sit below the baseline, and they're really, really easy to accomplish in CSS. So why are they so rarely used well on the web? We can adjust the size of drop caps across breakpoints, and on larger screens, we can utilize that extra space by pulling them into the margins. But why be satisfied just with plain drop caps when we can add borders to visually connect them with the art direction of the content or maybe the design of the publication? Or we can make a feature of this drop space by replacing caps with symbols or illustrations. It's like a modern twist on those religious texts from the first century. And now, of course, we can use CSS shapes to wrap text around these irregular elements. Now, this is an initial cap. It sits on the baseline rather than below it. And we can use either the same typeface or something completely different to reflect the content. And using drop caps in more than one paragraph, it helps to break up large blocks of text, and it draws the eye to the start of that next section. Or we can use pseudo elements to add decorative caps and then absolutely position them behind the content. And we can use initial caps for more than just indicating the start of a paragraph. They can be used for adding personality to headlines too. So maybe experiment by mixing a traditional serif cap with a more contemporary headline style. And in magazines and newspapers, you'll often find the first 3 words of this first paragraph emphasized in some way. Or you might use a pseudo class selector to apply that whole treatment to the whole of the first line. And this dynamically adjusts in length, which is perfect for responsive designs. So I've always believed that to make inspired design decisions, we need to feel inspired. And there's no better place than to start looking at work from other designers that we admired, and best of all, outside the web. Because the fundamentals of typography and layout and image treatment, they're the same whether we're working in print or on the web. We can't just apply print solutions to the web because our challenges are very different. And what we need to do is we need to look at other designers' work and understand the principles that they used and the context of when they were working. Now, people often say that the web isn't print, but there's actually not much difference between print and the web unless we choose to make it that way. Mark Porter also said, design is being in charge of the distribution of elements in space. And by elements, he meant headlines and text and artwork and white space. And actually, coincidentally, it was at The Guardian in 1988 that designer David Hillman first introduced white space to a newspaper layout, because before then it had been the province of magazines. So, when most people start developing a layout, they turn to a framework like Bootstrap. Now, I'm sure that everybody is familiar, whether you use Bootstrap or not, with this 12-column even ratio grid. And grids like this have underpinned website design since the days of, who remembers Grid 960 or 960 GS? All right. Any old people remember Blueprint before that? Yes, 1 or 2. I don't know why you're putting your hand up, youngster. Now, this grid has the potential to create an infinite number of layout combinations, and they've all got their own characteristics. So this has a throwaway kind of newspaper feel because we've removed most of the white space. White space and columns, they bring an editorial feel to a layout. And if we have images that bleed off the page, it reminds us of maybe a quality print publication. So, if we've got an infinite number of layout combinations possible, can somebody please, I'm looking for an actual answer, please explain to me why this appears to be all we're capable of making? Now, I can't take credit for that. I'm sure we've all seen the parody sites, every effing Bootstrap website ever. We've seen John Gold's famous tweet that's been doing the rounds that asks, which one of two layouts are you designing today? Now, look, frameworks are an easy target, I understand that, but our problem with homogeneous design doesn't come from Bootstrap's grid. It comes from our lack of imagination and our knowledge of how to use grid systems effectively. So even ratio symmetrical grids, they've been the foundation of design layouts for decades. And they provide columns to structure content, but they don't inform us as to how wide those columns should be or the relationship between columns. So maybe in this example, should our columns be, the main content be 8 columns wide, which is twice the width of the complementary sidebar? Or should the relationship between the column widths be any closer? And in my experience, the decisions that most designers make are made entirely on guesswork. So instead of guesswork, we can use mathematical ratios to inform layout decisions. And using ratios is particularly relevant to responsive design now, and it's made even easier by tools like Flexbox. So I doubt that there's many people that haven't seen this or heard of the 1 to 1.618 or the golden ratio. This is a naturally occurring ratio that's been used in architecture and art and design for centuries. But it offers more than just columns because we can use it to create a series of what are known as golden rectangles. And if you take a rectangle that's got golden proportions and you carve out a square, the space that remains, wow, it's another golden rectangle. And then carve out another square and create yet another golden rectangle. And these spaces are perfectly proportioned containers for content. And they suggest layout possibilities that we wouldn't likely come up with guesswork. But it's not the only ratio that's available to us. Is anybody familiar with a tool called GridSet? Mark Bolton's studio designed this before he went over to Monotype. Fantastic tool. And in that tool, it explains about different ratios, so you can learn all the different ones. And there's a close relationship between that golden ratio and Fibonacci numbers, where the number is the sum of the two numbers that come before it. And we can actually create layouts using squares where the size corresponds to these Fibonacci numbers. You know, it looks like, at first glance, to be some random arrangement of squares. But we can quickly turn that into a layout that's visually distinctive when we compare it to, what we see on much of the web. And in reality, Bootstrap's 12 even columns, we rarely use them for more than just alignment guides. But we don't have to work too hard to make distinctive layouts using Bootstrap's grid. So I can think of very, very few applications that need 12 columns. So the first step is always going to be to simplify. And we'll turn it into 6 more manageable columns. And this was the grid that was the foundation of some of my work for redesigning WWF's fundraising pages this year. And we placed two demands on the grid. We needed 4 even columns that we could combine into either 2 or 1, depending on our content. And then we needed a wider than average sidebar to hold the fundraising tools. So with that in mind, we subdivided that first column and then added one of those new little skinny columns to the width of the sidebar. And that made ample space for those fundraising tools. And using this approach, we made a grid that's really flexible. The layouts are easily responsive. And this is the homepage for our WWF redesign. I refuse to use pictures of snow leopards because there's bloody millions of those. But there's only 880 of my beloved mountain gorillas, so all my artwork had gorillas in it. What about that other column, the skinny column on the left? Well, we mostly leave that empty, which makes the layout asymmetrical, which adds some visual interest. But then occasionally, we pull content into that column to add some emphasis. So the map of where the last 880 mountain gorillas live in the world. And sometimes we'll indicate the start of a new section of content in a more imaginative way than, we see it all the time. Bootstraps or square spaces, full columns or full panels of content that go all the way to the edges. So here we're using that for the gorilla conservation timeline at the bottom. And good grid systems, they provide anchors for the content, but they don't contain the items on the page unless we make them. And using templates, it can speed up layout production. It can give our designs consistency, but we've got to be careful that we don't end up making all pages and therefore all websites look the same. Because there's no good reason why so many websites are indistinguishable from each other. When we use this grid imaginatively, we can create any number of distinctive designs. And some people will say, yes, but it matters how things work. People expect to find things in certain places, or they expect to find things looking like they expect. Well, that's true. And standards and best practice are good things, but in the right context. And we can leverage that familiarity with some types of content. But elsewhere, we can make full use of our imaginations, and we can add clarity to the content through expressive layout design. The possibilities for creativity are endless, which makes it even more maddening when countless websites fail to live up to their creative potential. And most importantly, they fail to add meaning to their content through carefully considered art direction and design. Now, at the beginning of this year, I worked with Vitaly on some creative concepts for Smashing Magazine's upcoming anniversary relaunch. And during this design process, we decided that a 6-column even ratio grid was the most flexible for presenting the editorial content. But sadly, the advertising that Smashing relies on was a poor fit for that grid because 1 column was too small and 2 columns were too big. So the solution was to use an alternative grid which was made from even columns, from 4 even columns. Now, nowhere is it written that we must use only 1 grid per page. In fact, combining 2 grids to create what's called a compound grid is an established design technique, but it's so rarely used on the web. And these 4 columns are perfectly proportioned for advertising. But the lines that are created by the 4-column grid, they also inform the size and position of other elements on the 6-column grid, including these Smashing conference promotions that are subtly interrupting the reading experience. And irregular shapes like this can help draw attention towards parts of the layout, and most usefully towards calls to action. So here we've got block and pull quotes that make it abundantly clear where to start and finish. Or we can add just a 100-pixel border to the bottom of these quotations, which adds visual interest, but it has zero impact on performance. We can use CSS shapes to extend this feature image into the content space, and then we can overlap the figure caption by using SVG to create this irregular background shape. Or finally, we can combine CSS shapes with the ghost of type elements to create unusual columns. Now, I have found that image choice is probably one of the least understood aspects of design among people who are in the startup space or the product design space. But images have an enormous impact on how people perceive our content, whether that be editorial or whether that be commercial. And product companies, they need a strong sense of self. And these images can play a big part in creating that. So cropping and positioning and full bleeds and viewport and scale and tension, they can all be used to add meaning to content. Now, so far, all the grid examples that we covered focused on columns. But that's only one dimension in layout. A second dimension comes from what were called horizontal fields. And the intersection of columns and fields creates grid modules. And modular grids offer us another way to create imaginative layouts. This modular grid makes it really easy to determine the format and the size of images. And we can choose type sizes that create lines with the most readable number of characters. Or we can use grid modules to inform the depth of white space that goes between elements. And we can create a series of page templates that they're different enough from each other to avoid repetition, but they still remain familiar. Now, simple stuff, figure captions. They offer readers a meaningful explanation of an image, which is, it's great for SEO, it's great for accessibility. But nowhere is it written that captions must always go below an image. That's where you normally find them. So just do something different. Position the caption above the image, and it's really simple to do, maybe by just reversing the flex direction. Or we can change that flex direction from column to row and position the caption at the side of the image. And Flexbox is brilliant because it makes it really easy now to align that caption's content to the bottom edge of the image. But why stop there? Let's use the modules in that modular grid to create a long vertical caption and then add some borders to emphasize the content. And if we've got a strong image, it needs a strong caption. So this is where designers can really put their mark on a design. We could have captions that complement the style of the images. Or we could just use that modular grid to help us crop the image and position and size the captions that we put over them. I'm going to use my water bottle. Now, we are so often told that the most effective websites are the ones that perform faster or they enable users to achieve their goals in record time. But, sometimes slowing someone down at key moments through their journey can create opportunities to tell our stories better and therefore get better results. And changing someone's perception of time within a two-dimensional space is something that comic books do very well. And we can learn a lot about controlling time from comics. Now, frames or panels are what most people associate with the layout of comic books. This is a 3x3 9-panel layout. It's pretty typical. And if you look for a moment, you might be reminded of that modular grid that I showed you earlier. And if you think responsively, you should also be able to imagine how this grid can be made to respond across different viewport sizes. So we can start with a vertical column of single panels on a small screen to groups of 3, and then ultimately to the equivalent of a double-page spread for those of us that use nice large displays. And when we read on a grid like this, our Western eyes, they follow a Z pattern. And the uniformity of these panel sizes hints at an even pace as we read across them. So this is Concrete by Paul Chadwick. He's one of my favorite comic books. I highly recommend that you seek this out. You might find the original comics knocking about, but you can buy the compendiums on Amazon. It's not like any comic book that you've read before. It's a fabulous example also of changing pace across panels. So Scott McCloud said in his brilliant book, Understanding Comics, that authors use panels of different sizes not just to contain various amounts of information or content, but to control the time that we spend looking at them. So if you take this row from Concrete, where the size of the panels is in step with the pace of the conversation, so the wider panels demand more time, and not just because they contain more content, and the narrower panels, they ask for less time. So it's slow, quick, slow. So if we break this down a little more, if we imagine that the wider panels on the outside contain the start and the end of something, it might be a conversation, it might be a train ride, it might be a fight between 2 enormous alien robots. When the panels in between are narrow, this suggests that the action happens really quickly because our eye skips across them. Whereas to give the impression that whatever happens more slowly, we use a larger, wider panel. And this technique works for vertical spaces as well. If you're looking down the cliff face, it's made more dramatic by that tall panel on the left. So what I want you to do is to imagine now how you might use a panel of that size and shape to make a product image more engaging, rather than just having the big full-width jumbotron at the top of every page. Look at this page. This is again from Concrete. Do you notice something unusual about that panel in the center? Now, in comics, where most panels have got borders, removing them also allows the eye to move out into the margins. And this creates a sense of timelessness. Now, this is in stark contrast to one of our typical designs, which have panels that run the full width of the page. And do you know what they do? They trap the eye inside those panels. So, by all means, utilize the full width of the page, but somehow allow the eye to travel around or maybe between those panels. And there are other ways that we can add a feeling of timelessness. Here we can allow a large image to bleed off the edge of the page. Or we can use large amounts of white space between a headline and a stand first combination. And that creates time for a pause and for a breath before someone starts reading. Or carefully considered block quotes that Jeremy Keith hates. They can intentionally interrupt the reading flow just enough to slow someone down enough to think about the content. Now, changing someone's perception of time isn't just something that we can do within a page. It's something that we can and we should do to influence the pace of people's journeys from page to page across our websites. So, I doubt there's many people that haven't read Watchmen at some point in their lives. Hands up, who's read Watchmen? Oh, not as many of you sad nerds as I thought. Keep your hands up if you read the original 12-part comic and not the graphic novel. Peter Gaston, that is respect, man. Respect. You are as old as I am. As old as the hills. Now, this isn't only a perfect example of how perception can be altered inside a two-dimensional space, but it's a fabulous example of how the author and the artist work together to make a layout that's essential to the way the story is told. This is part of Alan Moore's script, and in it, you can't really see here, he describes, and I quote, "The final panel on the page extends the full width of the page." So when he's writing the story, he's considering the layout of this page. And for the majority of Watchmen's 12-part series, it's told through these famous 9-panel per page format. One of the early chapters, it's even called Fearful Symmetry. And this continues almost unbroken for 11 episodes out of 12. And this is a cover for episode 11. And towards the end, we start to notice something subtle happening. The bottom panel extends the full width of the page, just as Alan Moore requested, and it slows the action down. And then, the final page of episode 11, nothing. A blank page. And if you remember, if you read the original comics, like Peter and I would have done, you'll remember that we had an entire month to wait until we could find out what happened next. And when episode 12 arrived, I worked in a comic book shop at the time. This was about 1987, something like that. And we closed the shop so we could read episode 12 before we let in the crowd of angry nerds that wanted to buy their copy. This is what we saw. Full page panels of carnage. 6 pages of total destruction with no dialogue and no action. Just complete horror. And it was made much more palpable by the layout in which the story was told. The problem with so many sites today isn't that they look so similar to each other, or that they follow fashionable design trends. You know, flat buttons actually don't matter that much. But what does matter is we're creating flat, monotonous experiences. Page after page of template-based layouts that have little or no relationship to the content that they're presenting. And while we are focusing our attention on patterns and performance, we're actually creating experiences that are almost completely devoid of personality. If we take a bird's eye view out of your website's layout, what are we going to find? Are we going to find a rich variety of layouts that artfully reflect your content and keep your customers interested? Or are we going to see a small selection of similar templates endlessly repeated? Think about how you can slow people down to carefully consider what you're saying or selling to them by using wide open layouts and elements that bleed off the page. Or make someone pause for breath. Give them space to read what you've written. And then speed them on their way and use denser blocks of content in small spaces. Art director Alexei Brodovich compared his spreads for Harper's Bazaar magazine to film sequences. And what he used to do is he used to lay the spreads out on the floor and then shuffle them until he got the best order. It's called a flat plan in magazine design. And reading a magazine is very different from reading a website, but we can adapt that plan to consider moments of someone's journey and when we want that to be fast or slow. And while it's not exactly the same, The Guardian, they understand how large blocks of content can slow people down and denser blocks help them pick up the pace. Now, David Hillman, who was formerly at The Guardian and New Statesman, he said, In its best form, art direction involves the art director having a full and in-depth understanding of what the magazine says and through design influencing how it's said. And this means that for many organizations, art direction is not easy to accommodate because an art director needs to work closely with the editorial team. In fact, art direction, design, and editorial, they're all equal partners. And in our industry over the past few years, we've made some ground in bringing creative and technical teams together, but it's not very common to see designers working side by side with editorial. But I actually think the reasons why we see so little art direction on the web go beyond that. When they're designing for digital media, art directors don't just direct the visuals, they shape a reader's experience of an article or maybe even an entire publication into one vision. And that vision is often deeply personal to them. It reflects their interests and their aspirations for the publication. And the most well-known art directors put themselves into their work. You know, it's opinionated. It's recognizable. You can see their fingerprints all over the work. And this goes counter to what we're so often told, which is that a designer's needs need to come second to the needs of users. Strong art direction on the web or anywhere else means trusting the instincts and judgment of an art director. But lately, instinct has been replaced by research. And we become so risk-averse that judgment now takes second place to testing. So to reduce our risk of exposure even more, we've become dependent on processes like atomic web design, breaking design into a set of predictable and repeatable patterns. And we've turned simple style guides into complex design systems, and we've put pattern libraries at the center of our creative processes. Pattern libraries, they do help designers to improve efficiency. You know, I spend a lot of my time now consulting with clients on how best to use them. But living style guides, they can help organizations maintain better consistency in user experiences across visual identities and different channels. But a cohesive experience needs more than just a guide to a library of patterns. It needs a singular creative vision, and that comes from art direction. Art direction can provide the strong set of design principles, and these are as applicable to digital channels as they are to the web. You don't need to look any further than Mark Porter's 2010 redesign of The Guardian to see now how the content and design and development teams have followed his design principles, and they've unified readers' experiences across apps and newsprint and the web. And occasionally, I'll hear people, designers, argue that popular processes like atomic design and tools like pattern libraries and style guides, they're not compatible with art direction because that demands flexibility in order to be original. But it's not true. I believe that to be truly effective, those processes actually need art direction to make them meaningful. Because without art direction, even attractive atoms and molecules and organisms and templates, they don't have anything more than superficial looks to unify them. In the very end, it's art direction that's the gravity that pulls atoms together. So these typefaces that I've used in the talk were all designed by the brilliant Dalton Mag. So thank you very much for encouraging my bad behavior, and have a fantastic conference.